In part 6 of our series on J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words, we covered the kind of basic aspects of chapters 8 through 9. But there were a lot of things that were not really touched upon. And so in this video, I just want to cover a number of things that Austin talks about. They're not absolutely essential, but they kind of flesh out his ideas. And so this is kind of bonus material that helps you figure out what he is trying to say. We're going to make 8 points here, and we'll go through them fairly quickly. We talked in the previous video about how a particular statement can work on a number of different levels. It can be a locutionary act, an illocutionary act, as well as a perlocutionary act. So we say something, in saying it we act, and by acting we cause yet another action. That's kind of roughly what Austin is saying here. Well, the first point to draw attention to is that it can be very difficult to keep illocutionary and perlocutionary acts separate. So for instance, if you look at he urged, that seems like an action. He persuaded, that's also an action. It's difficult to really tell the difference. Both of them seem to have a similar kind of use. Now, we did say that one is in saying something we are doing something, and the other one is by saying something we are causing somebody else to do something. So there are differences in terms of the use, but it can be difficult to tell them apart. And one thing Austin says is that what happens with this level, the illocutionary level, is that it's fairly conventional. We can reduce it to a kind of formula. So we might be able to say, let's say, I argue. Right? I argue you should shoot that person. But you cannot really say, I persuade you. I persuade you. That doesn't make quite the same sense. So one way to distinguish them between these different types of uses is that this more explicit kind of statement is often not available for the perlocutionary act. So that's point number one. Point number two is that Austin also wants us to think about how certain types of actions are not to be considered when we talk about performatives. And these are things like jokes, for instance. Jokes cause problems because we might say, for instance, there is a bull, and we might say, well, in saying there's a bull, I was only joking. There is not really a bull. It was just a joke. The problem is, how do we make sense of this? Is there an implicit act? Is joking an action that we are doing by saying that? It causes all kinds of trouble because we're not really taking the words literally. And there are other things we can add to that. So for instance, poetry. What if I say there is a bull, but I'm using the word bull metaphorically? Then poetry causes trouble as well. And Austin adds other things too. So he talks about things like insinuating, for instance. If you are insinuating something, if the tone makes a difference, well, that makes it very difficult for linguists to analyze your language. And the last one here is swearing. What if you utter a swear word? I won't give any examples here. We'll keep this clean. But what is happening there? Are we just relieving our feelings? Is it just an expression of, let's say, frustration? Austin's theory is somewhat limited in that he wants to just bracket that kind of exception to the rule and not deal with it. But I think you could actually say that sometimes using a swear word can lead to particular effects. It can have some kind of performative value, and a truly sophisticated theory of language should be able to deal with that to some extent. But Austin mostly ignores it. Okay, now the third thing to point out is that some of the old criteria that Austin had talked about earlier in his book do come back and are in play with these new ways of looking at performatives. So one of these things is happiness, for instance. And earlier, Austin had very much said that happiness applies to performatives but not to constatives. So constatives are either true or false, whereas performatives have to do much more with effectiveness. you have to be part of the performative, right? If I say, I pronounce you husband and wife, but you are not actually out to get married, then there is no happiness and no effectiveness. He comes back to this, and at this point he argues that there are different levels of success. So for instance, if you say, shoot him, then you could bungle that command. You could say the wrong word. You could say embrace him by accident. I'm not sure why I would, but maybe the words don't come out right, and that's a kind of lack of effectiveness. Whereas in this case, he urged me to shoot him. Here, the level of effectiveness has much more to do with happiness again, the sense that all the participants in the action have to be able to do their part. And so these old criteria do come back into play again. The fourth thing to point out is that when we think about perlocutionary actions, it can be very difficult to draw the line. So a particular speech act can cause a whole bunch of other actions down the line. And where do we stop? What is still a perlocutionary act? For instance, if I say, there's a bull in the field, and later I have a nightmare, is that nightmare still a perlocutionary act? That's just my example, not Austin's, but I think you can see what I mean. Number 5 is that sometimes we can skip the illocutionary level. So let's say somebody says, let's say you're in a bedroom with somebody, and somebody says, nice boots. Okay, seems like a very strange and innocuous kind of statement, right? But let's say it's my bedroom, and I think, those are men's boots. I'm married. Those are not my boots. Who has been in my bedroom? And then I think, oh, those look like Bob's boots. And now I go and I shoot him. We'll just combine the two sentences here. Well, when somebody said nice boots, they were not saying implicitly, you should go shoot Bob. But that is, in a sense, a perlocutionary action, right? That is something that came out of this particular statement. The point then is that sometimes we can have two levels. We can have the locutionary and the perlocutionary level skipping entirely the illocutionary level, which is kind of interesting that you have these results that are not implied but are connected to this particular statement. So, interesting point of view. Number 6 is a little tricky, and one of the things that troubles Austin continually is whether there's a clear break between the illocutionary level and the perlocutionary level. Can we really keep these things separate? Now, if you think, for instance, of a statement like shoot, so if we say shoot the donkey, okay, that could be the locutionary level here, then what distinguishes these different things? We have at the illocutionary level, we have he urged me to shoot him. Let's say him is the donkey here. And on the perlocutionary level, the shooting actually happens. So there's persuasion, and then there's the actual act that follows from this. Can we keep these things really, really separate? Well, Austin wants to argue that we can, and one way to get at this is he compares this to physical actions. So not actions through words, but physical actions. Let's say that somebody simply describes a physical action. Let's say somebody says, he shot the donkey. Right? He shot the donkey. We're not doing much with this, but we're just describing basically what's happening here. Well, if this is a physical thing that happens, then there's a bunch of stages or levels we could talk about. Somebody has to crook a finger, you have to pull the trigger, you have to hit the donkey dies, right? Do we make a distinction between moments in that chain reaction, or do we just simply say the whole thing together we can describe as one action? He shot the donkey. And Austin's point is that for physical actions, often we can describe the whole thing as one continuous motion of things. Whereas with words, he wants to say that we can make this fairly clear distinction between an illocutionary act and then this separate thing, the kind of perlocutionary act that follows later. And with words, things also seem to be much more unpredictable than with with physical actions. I can say something and it can lead to other words, it can lead to physical actions, difficult to predict. With physical actions, we tend to just lead to other physical actions. So that's another way to think about this fairly radical break between these two levels. All right, now we get to point number 7 out of 8, and I would say this is almost the most important point that he makes in chapters 8 and 9. And I've kind of tried to summarize it here for you. He says, illocutionary acts are not consequences of locutions. Now that part's fairly straightforward. In other words, it's not like you say something and then by doing that you might be arguing something, let's say. The two are really implicit, right? The two go together. So far so good. But then if we think of the effects of illocutionary acts, he needs to make sure he distinguishes these from perlocutionary acts, and so he suggests that illocutionary acts themselves produce only very limited effects. So we need to make sure that we don't confuse them with the more consequential effects of perlocutionary acts. Okay, now let's take an example here. Let's say I order you to bow down. Okay, so there is a statement. There are 3 ways in which this needs some, even at the illocutionary level, this requires some kind of response or effect for this to be functional. And the first one, the first level, he basically just calls uptake. So you have to understand what I'm talking about. The second level he refers to as taking effect. So this has to take effect. Okay. So I am trying to, I'm ordering you to bow down, and so the order is received in a sense. You might bow down as well. And the third one here is some kind of response. I invite a response. As you can see, this seems very close to the perlocutionary level, and it can be so difficult to keep them separate. If you say, I order you to bow down, and I bow down, then the bowing seems like a perlocutionary act. And so keeping the two separate is very difficult. But we can make a slight distinction here between these levels. Let's say somebody says, there is the king. Okay, so it's a different statement or a different sentence here. There is the king. And then based on that, I bow down. You can see that in this example, the perlocutionary level is much more distinct. And you can actually see the difference a little bit by thinking about 2 different ways of describing ordering. So you could say, I ordered him. I ordered him. And this seems much closer to the illocutionary level. And then the other way of thinking about it is by saying X, I got him to. I got him to. And that could be, I got him to bow down. So that seems more perlocutionary, where by our words we cause some kind of effect, as opposed to the illocutionary level, where in saying something, we do something, we order somebody. But you can see how difficult this is, because even the illocutionary level does require certain consequences. It's not as if only the perlocutionary level has consequences. Even at the illocutionary level, we do need some very basic kinds of responses and levels of understanding for this to work. But as you can see, it's very difficult and problematic. All right, point number 8, last point, very quickly. Both illocutionary and perlocutionary acts can be performed without words, so in a non-verbal way. But, at least for illocutionary acts, words are more likely to be necessary. Illocutionary acts very much depend on using words to do the action. Okay, so that's our bonus video. Hopefully that helps you make some sense of chapters 8 and 9. And stay tuned for our follow-up as we try to finish this series.